Hey now, I'm very excited. It's been a couple years since I brewed a Belgian Dubbel, and today I'm doing exactly that. I'm going to wind up doing a secondary fermentation with some dark fruit in there. It should have lots of flavor, be awesome to have on tap for the Christmas holidays, so come along for the ride. In our grist, the base is Weyermann Pils malt, and that's just about 67%. Then we've got 10% of Weyermann Abbey malt. There's 3.5% of Extra Special malt from Briess. You could also use Special B for that. And then 7.5% of Canada malting white wheat malt. And then there's also going to be some Belgian candy syrup and some turbinado sugar in here, but that'll be added during the boil. So it's time to mill this grain. My Monster Mill 3mm Pro is making quick work of this malt. The water didn't take very long to heat up since I'm only doing this 5-gallon batch. Now I am doing a protein rest on here just because I'm using that Weyermann Pils malt, and I find that sometimes it doesn't like to clarify all that well. So we're going to do that at around 50 Celsius or 125, 122 Fahrenheit. Let this sit here for about 20 minutes before we step up for the saccharification rest. And doing our little recirc here in the mash tun. Woo! That wort is pretty cloudy coming through the sight glass, but that should start to clear up as the starches convert to sugar. After a 20-minute protein rest, I'm now going to step this up to 65 Celsius or 149 Fahrenheit. After 60 minutes for saccharification, we are now ramping up to a mash out temp of 75 Celsius or around 168 Fahrenheit. After letting this mash out for 15 minutes here, just going to go ahead and set this up to fly sparge. And now we will fill up the boil kettle. And whoo! Flame on! We are just starting to hit a boil here. I'm going with a 90-minute boil just because of that Pilsner base, just to reduce potential DMS in the finished product. So just going to start the timer. For hops in this beer, I'm actually going with green bullet hops. They can offer just a little bit of subtle spiciness and sometimes even some hints of raisin and other dark fruits, which obviously would go super well in this beer. So I'm adding these at 40 minutes. This is a 13.2% alpha hop, and that's going to give me 24 to 25 IBUs, which is exactly what I'm looking for in this beer for bitterness. So in we go. I'm not really sure if much of that hop flavor might carry through. It's a 40-minute addition. It was 20 grams of those hops. There might be just the barest amount of it that still gets through with that amount of time left in the boil, but I guess we'll find out. So with 10 minutes left in the boil here, I'm going to be adding a pound of this D90 syrup. I've had this sitting in some hot water so that it should come out a little bit easier and we should be able to get all of it out in one fell swoop. Woo, look at how easily that's pouring out. Just going to squeeze it all out, do the toothpaste tube trick here. I am going to stir this up and in here before I add the other sugar. And I also have 370 grams of this sugar in the raw type stuff. I'm going to be sprinkling it in and stirring it like this. I just don't want any of the sugar to get stuck on the bottom and burn. So I want it to get into solution right away. And that should be good. At the end of that 90 minutes, it's just time to flame off. And we're not doing a flame out addition of hops or anything like that. So it's simply a quick whirlpool here just to help get a little cone of the hops and any troop that's kind of kicking around in here. Make it a lot easier to pick up the beer without getting a lot of that other junk in there. I'll just put the lid on here and give it at least 15 minutes to kind of settle out. So I've got my plate chiller hooked up here, and apparently I forgot the gasket in the one hose, but that'll be okay. Just catching a bit of the water there. And we are running off into the Carboy. Very exciting. Thus far we've got a 1059 original gravity, but we are not done with sugar additions. So now that I've got this Carboy up to its pitching temperature of 75 Fahrenheit. I'm just going to be aerating it here for a minute. Because the gravity starting out here is only 1059, I'm not actually worried about oxygenating it a whole lot, since the yeast pitch that I'm going to be putting in is quite substantial. Okay, so that was 1 minute of aeration. So the yeast I'm going to be pitching is the Yeast 3864 Private Collection Canadian Belgian blend. I really like that in this particular beer. This was a 3-liter starter that I grew up from slant, and then I chilled it down and decanted it down just to 1.5 liters. So it's a lot of yeast for not a whole lot of volume, which is nice. Okay, let's get this all ready to go. So I'm all ready for fermentation. I've got a sanitized Carboy hood and a thermo well, and that's where my temperature probe is going for my temp controller. I've got this blow-off hose that's going off into this bucket. Here we are 14 hours after pitching. See some really nice krausen happening here. Awesome. All right, as promised, that wasn't all the sugar that was going into this beer. So I've got 540 grams of that same sugar here. I'm going to be adding it to 270 grams of filtered water, so it's a 2-to-1 ratio to make a sugar syrup, a dark sugar syrup. I've got this water heating up. This is just in an Erlenmeyer flask, a 1-liter flask, and I've got it set up so that the water is already warm. It's around just over 100 degrees Fahrenheit right now, and the reason for that is that the sugar should be able to start mixing in a little bit easier right now than if it was cold. And I want to mix in as quickly as possible, just because I don't want this to be sitting here while it's on this hot element with a bunch of solids on the bottom. So I'm going to be mixing it up here every minute or so, just until it becomes a nice syrup, and I'm going to let it pasteurize. You could do this on a stovetop, you could do it on a pot, different ways to do it, but I've got the flask, so I'm going to use the flask. I'm going to have it covered up just like so, and that's going to prevent anything from falling into the solution while it's mixing and pasteurizing. All right, here we are. This is after 45 minutes, sitting at somewhere between 140 and 140 Fahrenheit, so we're nice and pasteurized. It's also still really nice and warm, so it's going to flow out of here really quite nicely. You can see that the beer here is just starting to slow down, and that's because we pitched all that yeast at that somewhat lower gravity, more yeast than it needed for that particular gravity. So I've got my funnel, once again, Star San sanitized. Let me just plunk that down like so, and taking my flask here, pouring it in just like this. Now this is definitely warmer than the fermenting beer, but because this is not a lot of volume, it shouldn't change the temperature too terribly much. Let's do that. And plunk this back in here after making sure not to have touched anything with it, and let the fermentation continue. I will admit that I'm starting to get nervous because of the volume of cherries I'm going to put in here. It is going to get quite high, so I'll have to be careful when I do that. The next day it's a little odd. The krausen has definitely fallen down a bit here, but it's definitely actively fermenting. The forced attenuation test on this Dubbel before the cherries go into it comes in at 1010. So not necessarily super accurate because we're not quite sure what the cherries will do to that fermentation. For the fruit addition to this beer, I've got some pitted sweet dark cherries. These were frozen when I purchased them, and I just put them into a vacuum bag, which always pops when you heat the frozen stuff up to this temperature. And I've been sous vide pasteurizing them here for a couple hours at 150 degrees, and we are ready to add to the Carboy. Okay, so to prepare for this, I've got my sanitized funnel. And now a guy would want to possibly keep this to reuse afterwards, but since I've got some spares here of the thermowells as well as this Carboy hood, I am just going to set it down here. That way I don't have to be worried about trying to keep it up in the air and sanitize and all that stuff in the meantime. Next, I have my big old bag of cherries here, which has cooled down a little bit. I wanted it to get at least into the 80s Fahrenheit before I cut into it. Again, Star San sanitized scissors, everything sanitized. And here we go. Let's start to add this. I'm not going to lie, I am getting very nervous about the amount of volume inside this Carboy. We'll see how this goes. One of the nice things about sous vide pasteurizing these cherries here is that you wind up extracting so much juice out of them during that process, let me set this aside here for a sec. And them having been frozen also allows for the cell walls to be that much easier just to break down. Everything will be, all those sugars and flavors will be more accessible to the yeast and to the beer itself. I have a nice sanitized wooden spoon. I actually also had this in the sous vide pot there, so it really did kind of pasteurize with everything else here as well. Whew, we seem to be a little bit more aggressive than before. So I've added these cherries. Looks like we were really flying. Maybe a little too close to the sun here, we'll see. I am aware that these cherries will lower the original gravity of this beer just a little bit. Not super concerned about that. I'm more interested in getting that cherry flavor into the finished product. And you can see I've got my new replacement thermal well and the Carboy hood up on there. And we are still back at 75 degrees Fahrenheit and ready to keep going. Nearly 24 hours after adding the cherries, it appears that I have avoided disaster. It is up nice and high because it's displaced a bunch of volume with all those cherries, but we are a-okay. After having that temperature nice and high there for several days and hitting terminal gravity, I slowly chilled it down here and then let it sit in the mid-60s for a few days. You can see that that yeast has really dropped out quite nicely, which is fantastic. I am now just pressure transferring that into a corny keg. You can check out the full process and setup for that in the brewing playlist on the channel. Reading below the meniscus on this fully fermented cherry double, we've got a finishing gravity of 1010 that actually matches the forced attenuation test. Super sweet. Can't wait to try it. So after chilling down that keg, gelatin fining, transferring into a destination carbonation keg, carving that up, I got it on tap. I got my cozy hoodie on here. It's really cold outside and I cannot wait to try this beer. So let's do it. Look at that. Beautiful. Oh man, this smells like rich cherry. We've got that Belgian spiciness to it. There's just like a hint of nuttiness and some dark fruit to it. Let's see how she tastes. Just like it smells. Gorgeous. It has this super delicious dark sugar character going on here too that pairs really nicely with that with the cherries there. So that dark sugar syrup is playing super nicely with it. The Abbey malt, the extra special malt. This is an absolutely fantastic beer for a cold weather day, and it's like minus 40 something degrees Celsius right now with the wind chill. So this is stellar. And no, I'm not going to go outside to drink this. I'm just going to look out the window at it so I don't freeze to death. Now this beer did have quite a few steps to it there, not just with the brewing, but then doing that chapitalization and getting that gravity back up to around 1070, which is where I was sort of wanting it because I knew I was going to drop it just a little bit there with the cherry addition, but we're still talking about a 7% beer here in the finished product, which is exactly what I was looking for just a nice, not crazy over the top, but really, really flavorful holiday/winter beer. So big win in my book. If you want to try this or something like it, absolutely do it. There is no way that you can possibly lose. So until next time, keep your beers at 11.